Hello, and thank you for joining our webcast on creating a federal water bill assistance program. I'm Andy Winkler. I help lead BPC's work on infrastructure and housing. With support from the Mott Foundation, BPC has been working over the past few years to elevate issues around water infrastructure and affordability. As many of you tuning in today know, rates have been rising steadily in recent years, making it increasingly difficult for low-income families to afford their water and sewer bills. This trend could be amplified by COVID-19 related financial hardships and even lead to widespread service shutoffs. Some members of Congress have made providing aid to low-income households to help pay water bills a COVID-19 relief priority. For example, the HEROES Act passed by House Democrats included a proposal that supplements the longstanding Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, a federal grant program providing energy and heating bill assistance. We hope to put that idea today into context to explore the need and rationale behind ideas like that, the options being considered, and their prospects for becoming law. First and foremost, I want to thank all of you joining today again for making the time. If you're joining us on YouTube, please use the chat function on the side to submit any questions you have throughout the event. Our team will be keeping an eye on them as we go, and we'll reserve the last 20 minutes to answer any outstanding questions that you have. You can also submit questions via Twitter using hashtag BPCLive or by tweeting at BPC_bipartisan. So now I want to introduce our panelists today. I am very pleased to be joined by Laurel Firestone. First, Laurel was appointed by Governor Newsom to the California State Water Resources Control Board last year. Prior to joining the board, she co-founded and co-directed the Community Water Center, which is a statewide nonprofit environmental justice organization working particularly in California's Central Valley to help disadvantaged communities access safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. Next, we have May Stevens. May is an executive vice president at Signal Group in DC. She has a range of clients, public and private, in the water sector. And she was previously the environmental policy advisor to Senator Ben Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, and has worked very extensively on legislation affecting water, equity, and affordability. And finally, we have Manny Teodoro. Manny is a professor at Texas A&M University, although he will soon be joining the faculty at the University of Wisconsin. Congratulations. His blogs and his research are essential reading for anyone interested in water utility, finance, management, equity, and affordability. And so from here, I just wanted to give each of our panelists a few minutes to introduce themselves and to kind of share their perspective on this issue. So I'll go ahead and start with Laurel.
Great, thank you so much. As you mentioned in my introduction, I've spent the past 15 years working with communities in California that lack access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water on a daily basis. I'm now one of 5 members of the State Water Board, which oversees water quality, drinking water, and water rights in our state. This administration and this governor have made access to safe and affordable drinking water one of the biggest priorities. And this year, or actually last year, the state legislature passed a $1.3 billion fund, which allocates $130 million each year to support access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. Really, the focus of that fund is to not only leverage other existing capital funding and implementation strategies that we have around drinking water assistance, but also really think about system level affordability and how to make sure that water providers can supply access to safe drinking water and have sustainability and resilience as we navigate the different stresses on water provision. As we've seen with COVID-19, there is a lot of nexus between system level affordability and individual affordability. And so our resources in this program are limited And we have been looking at how to support individual affordability and shutoff protections, in particular, now that this crisis has made that a lot more evident. We we actually released a report this earlier this year, recommending with recommendations around what a statewide low-income ratepayer assistance would look like in our state. We have a lot of work that went into that over years of work with stakeholders and researchers. And so at this point, we would need legislative action and funding to put that in place. But we've done a lot of the groundwork around what an effective program would look like, why it's needed, and how it would interface with other drinking water assistance programs in our state.
Great. Thank you, Laurel. May, you want to take it from here?
Having me, Bipartisan Policy Center. Thanks for everybody tuning in. I know there's a lot that you could be doing on a summer afternoon, so I appreciate you sitting in front of a computer and listening to us talk. And so look forward to a great discussion. It is true, my name is May Stevens, and I'm an executive vice president at Signal Group. I spent the last 8 years working for Congress, most recently as Senator Cardin's water infrastructure staffer. My first major foray into water infrastructure was writing the Senate Democrats' response to the lead crisis in Flint, which at its heart, really, if you think of it as an affordability crisis as well. And what I learned through the process is there are about 100 factors that go into whether or not a family can afford their water bill every month. And so I strongly believe in 100 solutions. I think that there's not one silver bullet to solving this problem, and that we all need to do everything to fix it. So now I'm working with the largest utilities in the country, some of the smallest utilities in the country, on incentivizing them to work together and regionalizing their approach to serving their customers. I think that this is a great way of driving down costs, getting those economies of scale that are needed for a lot of the smaller utilities out there, and really getting more bang for buck, which means that we're addressing affordability as those rates are passed through to their customers. But there's still systemic income inequality in the United States, and as much as I would like for not a single American to spend one day under the poverty line, I am only one woman, and I cannot make that happen overnight. So I think there is always going to be people who are going to have a hard time paying their water bills just because of the nature of the economy, and I think that stinks. But one of the things that we can do is working on a bicameral, bipartisan bill that I had the honor of writing for Senator Cardin before I left the Hill, that would create an assistance program like SNAP or LIHEAP, housing vouchers, that would help people who need help with their water bills. And I'm really glad to see that's gaining momentum, as Andy talked about in the opening. So I'm really excited to be here today. I'm really excited to hear about all of the things that Manny and Laurel are working on. And I'm really interested in finding ways to solve this really important problem. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, May. Manny?
Yes, thanks. Howdy from Houston, Texas. Great to be with everyone today. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for Bipartisan Policy Center for having me part of this panel. I've worked in water and sewer finance policy management since 1997, so it's been a long time. I started in a consulting firm where I worked as an economist on financial and management issues for water and sewer systems. I returned to graduate school a few years after that, and since I really have been working on management policy, finance for water systems ever since. My first work on affordability was in 2006, so I've been at this for a while as well. I've published widely on all of these issues, especially on affordability, particularly over the last few years as the issue has gained some momentum. So in general, I'd say I'm a social scientist of water and sewer utilities. I work on finance, regulation, management, politics, and increasingly on environmental justice issues. When it comes to assistance programs, Customer assistance programs are important, and we can think of them. I'm sort of picking up on one of the themes that May raised. I think we want to think about assistance programs as one tool in a comprehensive toolkit. It's perhaps a complement to more fundamental systemic kinds of policies that we can address. So there are some important limits to what we can do with assistance. Assistance is useful in a lot of ways. But I think what we need to keep in mind is that it's one part of a broader strategy.
Thanks so much, Manny. So maybe from there, I'll turn it back to you to talk a little bit about the rationale behind sort of having a federal assistance program as opposed to assistance programs at each individual water system or utility.
Sort of different rationales you can think of. So there's sort of two parts to your question there. There's one is the rationale for the program generally, and then there's the why federal versus individual systems. I think we've already alluded in our introductory remarks to some of the broader questions. So you can think of sort of macro trends that are driving the need for or the demand for affordability assistance. There's sort of a political logic, and then there's the timing with this pandemic. We've already alluded to that historically, water and sewer have been relatively cheap. The inflation rate for water and sewer rates has been significantly higher than CPI over the last 20 years. The prices for things like energy and telecom have flattened or even fallen over the last 20 years. Water and sewer have continued to go up. So water and sewer prices are increasing much faster than the general economy. So there's and that's happening at a time of real declines or stagnation in working class wages that May referred to a moment ago. So that's creating pressure for working class families to pay for their water and sewer bills. That economic reality is turning into a political reality for utility managers and elected officials. And then I think LIHEAP provides a handy touchstone. It's a program that a lot of people are familiar with. It's been around for 40 years. People kind of are familiar with it, so that there's sort of kind of a comfort and logic. There's a sort of a sound, kind of an easy political logic to say, well, gosh, the federal government provides assistance for energy because it was expensive. And now we think water and sewer is expensive, so maybe the federal government ought to provide some assistance for water and sewer. And then, of course, COVID-19 provides a kind of catalyst that's driving, sort of highlights a need that was always there. Water affordability has always been a public health concern. That's simply been highlighted by the fact that everyone's homebound, or so many of us are homebound, and the demand for us to maintain high levels of sanitation. So why federal instead of local? That gets to some of the structural realities of the water sector that I can get into if you'd like. But I mean, the main thing, I guess, Greg, can we go to the first slide? I think if you wanted to make a case for why a federal strategy is maybe a good idea, is this slide. One of the things that you'll see here is that there are water systems in the United States. So the single, probably the overriding organizational reality or imperative for anything we want to do with water is to address the realities that are reflected in this slide. There are 50,000 water systems. That's an order of magnitude more than electricity and gas combined. So there's just a lot of water systems out there. And you'll notice that structurally, they're very different from the energy sector. Electricity and gas are overwhelmingly operated by the investor-owned sector. Investor-owned firms run our gas and water systems by and large. 85% or 84% of Americans get their drinking water service from a local government. Only about 16% are private investor-owned firms. So we're talking about an intergovernmental problem. And the challenge of providing assistance to all 50,000 of those systems becomes an implementation challenge and a matter of local politics. So there are some local utilities that are doing a fine job, or at least trying to do a fine job with assistance programs, but there are plenty more who are not. So that's kind of one of the arguments here for trying to do something more comprehensive at a broader level. It's just that there are 50,000 of those systems out there.
Maybe I'll turn it to May, because as Manny mentioned, LIHEAP for water is this sort of tangible idea that politically people can grasp. And so a lot of water associations, advocacy groups, et cetera, have coalesced behind this idea. But having worked on the Hill, and especially on legislation to introduce an idea similar to this, sort of what do you think of how an idea like this gains bipartisan support? What are sort of the pieces of legislation options moving right now? And if you had to kind of prognosticate, if you had to predict over the next coming months, especially with COVID-19 cases surging in a lot of states around the country, is this a moment in which we could finally get something done?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think what I would say is that, one, just to sort of dovetail from what Manny was just talking about, I think there's another perspective to this as well. The reason why we would want this at the federal level instead of the state or local government is I think exactly what we saw in the 2008 crisis, and also, frankly, in the crisis that we're seeing right now. And there's an economic downturn. It hits cities and states differently, depending on where they are in the country. So in 2008, there was a big concern about in the Midwest and the automotive companies and the supply chains that supply the parts to manufacture cars. That was in a real crisis, and we saw that to be a problem. Whereas, maybe it didn't affect manufacturing as much as in, in Arizona, for example. But the housing crisis was really bad in Arizona. So each state gets affected differently. The same thing is true in coronavirus, where you saw the spikes going, different places. Some places had to close, all economic activity much sooner than others. And so I think that it makes a lot of sense to sort of spread that risk around the entire country instead of just hoping that, for example, Michigan can bail out the automotive industry at the same time that it is making sure that people can afford their water. Usually you can't do two crises at the same time. So that's why I would say that, it's a good idea to have a safety net at the federal level, as well as the state and local level. I mean, a lot of utilities are doing this on their own already. They just need a lot more help on it. So that's sort of the first thing I would say. I think the reason why this gained such bipartisan and bicameral support, this bill was introduced in 2018 by Senator Cardin from Maryland and Senator Wicker from Mississippi, Congressman, members of Congress Fudge and Katko in the House. And the reason for that, I mean, they're very geographically diverse members. They have very different states. I think the reason why this really appeals to everybody is because politicians are responsive to their constituents, as it should be. This is a representative democracy, right? And so I think that, when you go into an office, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they can see that everybody needs water, no matter what party you are. And that, a lot of families are struggling regardless of who they vote for in November. And so given that situation, I think that there are a lot of people that just really see the need for some sort of assistance. And I would just say that I think that we solve this problem with LIHEAP in the electricity sector, but we also have SNAP or food stamps. We used to call them food stamps, now we call them SNAP. So because we recognize that everybody, regardless of party, needs food. The same thing is true with housing vouchers. Everybody, regardless of party, needs a roof over their head. And so we want to help them with that. Those are all federal programs. We have a lot of programs like that because, frankly, people need it. People are struggling out there, especially now, but kind of all the time. There are lots and lots of people that are struggling. We can certainly get into income inequality, but I think that that's one of the real issues that we're seeing here. So I think your last question was sort of a prognostication of whether or not this can move forward. I certainly hope so. I think that the fact that this program was funded at $1.5 billion and it's passed the House twice now shows that there is real political support on the House side for that, for the bill. I think that the fact that the Senate, we can get into Senate procedure as well if you'd like, but the Senate operates a lot differently, where you need both the majority and the minority to come to an agreement. You got to get 60 votes, and neither the Democrats or the Republicans have 60 votes right now. So that means that they have to work together if they want to solve anything. And I think the fact that this is a bipartisan, bicameral bill, I think really, really helps that. I also have been really excited to see that, sort of through the Democratic primary and certainly President Trump have both made infrastructure, sort of both parties, everybody in both parties have made infrastructure a big priority through the campaign. And so I think regardless of who wins the White House, I think we're going to talk a lot more about that in the future. So I'm very hopeful. So
great, thanks, May. I wanted to turn it over to Laurel, since she has, in her work with the control board in California, they have considered a wide range of actual options to implement a statewide program. I think that provides some lessons learned potentially for federal lawmakers as they're considering different ways of providing water bill assistance. It's easy to conceptually think, oh, we could recreate LIHEAP and make it for water, but like Manny said, the sectors are incredibly different. Water is dominated by many small water systems. So maybe you can speak to how California is approaching this in the recommendation that you made.
Great, thank you. So we have looked through a variety of approaches and challenges, and I think learned a lot through working with stakeholders. One context to understand, as Manny explained, that there's huge fragmentation in the water sector, and that means that there's less ability to spread costs within a water system itself, which is, one of the reasons why there needs to be a statewide and ultimately federal funding program for this, because it can't be funded by water systems internally alone. Also, understanding that federal investments in water system upgrades has declined over time, which means water systems are already having to raise rates faster in order to meet those infrastructure costs and the increased costs of providing water service. And so we looked at a number of challenges to how to deliver these kinds of services. We looked at LIHEAP, we looked at food stamps, we looked at a variety of existing programs we have at the state level to provide assistance within the energy sector. One thing that we basically ended up finding that, or recommending that there be three components of a statewide program. One is direct credits on water bills, and that would be administered or overseen and administered at a state level, but show up for customers through their water bills. A second is understanding that actually, at least in our state, and this may be the case in other states, most low-income residents are either renters or in multifamily housing, and so they don't get water bills directly. And so the type of delivery for assistance there needs to look different. The other sort of big difference is that we don't have submetering for water in our state, except for a few newer developments, and so that really makes it difficult to and different from the energy sector in a lot of ways. And so we looked at, to address that, we looked at and we recommend providing a tax credit rather than trying to track down and work through the sort of landlord-tenant issues, but still make sure that we're providing relief, since those households do pay for water service just indirectly. We also recognize that in addition to those subsidies and assistance programs on an ongoing basis, that there's households in crisis, and we can see that certainly with the current pandemic, and that in addition to this, the overall subsidy program, there needs to be some crisis assistance. And so we have recommendations around making sure that we can provide crisis assistance to households to prevent shutoffs. A lot of our recommendations and the way that we narrowed down how they would be administered was really trying to reduce variability in how people in the coverage itself. So, for example, in our state, food stamps and some of these programs are administered and overseen through counties and local governments, and there's real variability in how that reaches and how that's administered and reaches individuals. And so we recommend and structure this so that there's oversight by our statewide agency to make sure that the way this is administered is meeting standards. And that's similar to a statewide program called CARE on the energy sector. It's really important to make sure not only that there's assistance, but that there's oversight in how this is administered, that it's reaching the folks and effective in terms of enrollment, and that the way that it's done is addressing some of these system level challenges. So integrating with overall programs to address system level challenges. And I'm sure, I think both of the other speakers mentioned this, but if we're providing subsidies to these costs, we also need to be looking at how to encourage and move towards economies of scale by water systems themselves. And so that's where thinking about consolidations and how the state can help ensure that these sorts of assistance programs are furthering that effort around system sustainability and not inadvertently undermining it. And I think lastly, just really working through how to reduce overhead costs and increase efficiency. And I think a lot of times these programs the costs are eaten up a lot by the creating a whole new structure to administer and the cost of that overhead. And so we were really looking at how to meet people where they're already paying these or receiving credits, so that we're not having to increase more than necessary the kind of administrative costs that go along with this.
Thanks, Laurel. I think that's really helpful context for both federal policymakers and for other states that are considering sort of similar options. I did want to quick remind all of our viewers that you can submit questions for the panelists via the chat function if you're watching on YouTube, and tweet them on Twitter. You can use hashtag BPC Live or tweet at BPC, which is at BPC_bipartisan. So I want to turn from there to back to Manny to talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons of those options, and in particular how smaller systems in disadvantaged communities can best access an affordability program like the one that Laurel laid out.
Yeah, I think you hear in Laurel's description a really refreshing attention to implementation, and the challenges of making a program like this, or any program in the water sector, really work. The California Water Affordability Assistance initial bills were passed some years ago, and the State Water Board's been working for several years now to try to hammer out all these very complicated details. And I think one image can help explain why. Greg, can you throw up that second slide? U.S. community water systems across the United States by size. So you see the size categories there. As we saw earlier, there's 50,000 community water systems in the United States. And what you see here in the blue bars is the number of systems by the size of the population that they serve. Over half of those community water systems serve fewer than 500 people. That's not 500,000, that's 500 people. Okay, and you see how that's distributed. The largest systems, the 434 largest systems, that blue bar on the far right, serving more than 100,000, they serve about half the U.S. population. So half the systems serve those tiny systems that serve fewer than 500 people, collectively, they serve about 2% of the U.S. population. And that tiny bar on the right, that little blue bar with 400 systems, that serves about half the U.S. population. And you can see the green bar showing the population served. The thing to know about those utilities on the left-hand side of this graph is that not only do they serve few people, they have very few employees. Most of these are going to have fewer than one FTE. Maybe they have 2 or 3 full-time employees, so they just don't have capacity. And here's the other thing that maybe we don't think about very much. The most severe affordability challenges are in those small systems. And guess what? They also have the most severe water quality problems. Places like Detroit and Baltimore and Cleveland and these large cities get the attention, but the most severe affordability problems are actually in those small systems. Places like rural Alaska, the South Texas, Rio Grande Valley, the Central Valley of California, Southeast Ohio, these areas that are rural communities that don't get those economies of scale, that also have relatively impoverished populations. So one of the hard realities of any assistance program or any initiative to help with affordability in the United States is the reality of this graph, and that the administrative capacity to do anything in those small systems is severely limited. A utility that only has 1 or 2 full-time employees is not going to be able to devote significant labor to doing things like income qualifying. Every one of those systems has its own billing software, its own rates and billing and metering procedures. Making those things dovetail with assistance programs is extremely costly to those small systems. So getting small systems to turn into large systems is critical to making anything work. It's difficult to see how the bill, certainly as the HEROES bill is written, how an assistance program for water would work for these small systems because of the administrative challenges involved.
Thanks. So I want to turn it back to May, because I know she has worked very closely not only in developing the legislation for Senator Cardin, but with smaller systems and associations. What are sort of, putting this whole plan into context, and given this sort of moment of crisis, not just for households, but also for utility management, they are facing declining rate revenue. They may have trouble finding financing for their projects, given all the disruptions in the bond market and everything else. So can we put sort of into context this idea of customer assistance for the smallest systems and what in this moment of crisis is most important?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100% with Manny when he says that these tiny water utilities have, maybe one full-time person, maybe one part-time person, or maybe just a volunteer running their water utility, that those people are not in any way going to have time to manage a assistance program. So we worked really hard when I was in Senator Cardin's office. We worked really hard with the small utilities, both in Maryland and the National Water Association, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, who I still work with today. I'm very pleased to still be working with RCAP. But we worked with them to try and design the program so that for large and medium-sized utilities, they are probably already running a assistance program in some way or another. Detroit has one, Baltimore has one. There are still very famous cases in both of those places of people not being able to afford their water bills, even with those assistance programs. So obviously that's a case for us to do more. But for the small water utilities that don't have anybody that's going to be able to verify people's incomes and check with folks and take the applications and verify with the IRS and do all the paperwork, we actually put into the Cardin-Wicker and the Fudge-Cacco bill for the small utilities. They would, the governor of the state would work in an MOU with the state, with the very smallest utilities. He can lump all the small utilities together to create sort of a partnership, like something like Manny and I are both working on in our own capacities. But to have utilities band together, have the governor of the state do the application process with the EPA, and then the governor of the state actually run the program, because we realize that is just something that is outside of the capacity of a lot of these water utilities. And I think that brings me to another quick point that I will mention that I work with on RCAP a lot. And that is that a lot of these utilities, if you have one person or one part-time person working at your utility, you probably don't have the capacity to be an accountant, a lawyer, a water quality engineer, right? All of those different things. So a lot of what these small systems need are technical assistance. And that's where the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, among many other organizations, but RCAP is a very big one in the United States, all over the United States, that provides technical assistance to these utilities. I think that is something that is still going to be sorely needed, because I think that, there are obviously, and I think Laurel can speak to this, but I think there are a lot of really tiny utilities, that are very, very rural in, Alaska, for example, a lot of places that are, very rural. But at the same time, there are a lot of water utilities that are, say, in LA County has tons of water utilities. Why are they not just connected to the city of LA? And that seems like it would be a good idea to just connect up all of those water utilities and create those economies of scale in that area. But, if there's a community of 100 people and then it's 100 miles away from a community of another 100 people in Alaska, it's going to be really hard with 200 people to support a giant 100-mile pipe between those two. And I'm not saying that that's the only solution. I'm just saying that some rural utilities are actually very far apart from each other. And so it's going to be really hard for those utilities to physically connect. But that's why I think, Manny and I are both working on, ways for water utilities to work together without necessarily physically connecting their pipes. So whether that's technical assistance or whether that's, just sharing resources, you hire the water quality engineer and I hire the accountant and we share each other's staff like that. Those are all creative solutions to this problem. And I think we need 100 solutions to this problem because there's 100 reasons why people can't afford their water bills. So.
Great. So I want to raise a question we have from the audience, which gets exactly to your point. Emily Simonson asks about what you think about the role of federal carrots and sticks on regionalization and consolidation. That, I think, speaks to your sort of issue that we should encourage some of these smaller water systems in particular to partner in different ways, not necessarily formal merging together, although that may be appropriate in some instances, but also just sharing staff, ordering supplies together, things like that. What do you think is the best sort of federal role for encouraging those sort of partnerships?
Is that question to me?
Manny, if you want to take that one first, and then we can go back to Manny.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no, it's important. The federal carrots and sticks are huge. In fact, federal government doesn't really run many water systems other than maybe on military bases and a couple of other oddball situations. Federal government isn't in the water business. The federal government is in the regulatory business and to some extent in the funding business. So those are respectively sticks and carrots. If we want to improve things at the federal level, unless someone's contemplating a federal takeover of the 50,000 water systems in America, which I don't think is on the table, it's all about carrots and sticks. And right now, the carrots and the sticks are, the carrots are leading in bad directions and the sticks are beating the utilities in wrong directions. We've got a lot of systems, a lot of federal programs, or I should say at least some federal programs, that create perverse incentives. And I'll give you an example. There are rural assistance programs that give funding to small systems, and part of the funding formula is to show that your system's really terrible, that it's out of compliance, that it's terribly unaffordable. And so if I have a small system, I can go to USDA rural development programs and say, hey, give us a few $1 million to build a new treatment plant, when it might actually be way cheaper for me to hook up to the larger community, a few miles up the road, but I wouldn't get a grant for that because then I would no longer be a small system. So we actually have weird disincentives. We also have a regulatory structure. So that's going from the carrots. If we go to the stick side, we have regulatory institutions. Let me tell you one of the dirty little secrets of the water sector. Small systems play by different rules. They actually get a different set of water quality standards. They get different inspection frequency. They don't comply with at the same level with the same kinds of standards. So not only do they get carrots that lead them in the wrong direction, there's no stick, or there's very rarely a stick, especially if we're talking about small publicly owned water systems. So yeah, the first thing that the federal government can do is just to stop. They say when you're in a hole, stop digging. If you're trying to get out, the first thing to do is stop digging. The first thing we can do is remove these perverse carrots and sticks, and then maybe move toward getting those carrots and sticks pointing in better directions.
I wanted to turn it back to Laurel because I know California has worked a lot, and especially your role before the Water Control Board in the Central Valley, with connecting systems that faced water quality issues, that didn't have the resources to to improve their systems, finding ways to connect them to nearby systems so that they can extend service. So maybe you can speak to some of those dynamics on the kind of local and state level of how you approach sort of regionalization, how you can encourage that, but also not let communities lose their voice in that kind of an approach.
Yeah, I think this is a critical issue in the water sector. And if we're going to design a low-income ratepayer assistance program and assistance at the federal level, this context that I think each of us are laying out with that how the water sector's fragmentation and current structures it frankly increase costs for individuals by reducing economies of scale and reducing the kind of investment that's possible at the local level for operations and infrastructure improvements. So there's a piece of this that is around how do we create economies of scale, move systems towards more sustainable structures. And California is extremely focused on that within our assistance programs right now. With this new investment that we've created at the state level, really the whole focus is how do we bring all of our tools to bear on moving systems to more regional and economies of scale, connections to larger systems, and reducing these small systems that are really the most vulnerable and the least able to address and kind of weather these challenges that we're having more broadly in terms of whether it's climate change or economic downturns. I think it's important in this context, though, to recognize that what this means for a low-income ratepayer assistance program through the federal government is really making sure that any program that's developed is integrated with these efforts at the state level and federal funding to address the water sector more generally. I think a lot of the programs that folks are talking about at the federal level are really disconnected from those same programs that are trying to encourage overall water system sustainability and affordability. And I think that really undermines the ability for all of this to reinforce the kinds of changes and patterns in the water sector that are needed. So I think one of the key considerations for the federal government to understand is that these sort of that the agencies at the state level that are receiving this kind of fund and overseeing its implementation should really be part of the overall water system regulatory and funding programs. And so I would say there's a lot that each state is doing. Each state has their own context and different strategies to address these challenges. Totally agree that these policy issues need to be front and center overall within water funding and regulatory programs. But also, like I said, I think recognizing that this needs to be an integrated strategy and not sort of one-off programs in different agencies that may inadvertently be undermining each other.
Great. So I wanted to turn it over to another submitted question from Chad. He asks, beyond the differences in system scale that we've talked about, what are your thoughts on how we overcome differences in the cost of water supply? So, for example, some communities may source clean water from a nearby river, others must pump it from the ground. How do those contribute to the differences in cost, and how can we address those? Maybe I'll turn it over to Manny.
Sure. Well, let me start with a general caveat that I'm a social scientist, not an engineer. So I'm not going to speak to the specifics of the technologies involved here. As a general statement, though, on supply, More supply sources are always, all else equal, more supply sources are better than fewer supply sources. Diversification of a supply portfolio is like diversifying your investment portfolio. More supplies means that you're more secure in case of any kind of an emergency. And in some cases, that's going to be costlier in raw dollar numbers, but we're actually back here to economies of scale. So while I'm not going to speak directly to this question of different costs of different supply sources, I do think there's an important thing here to keep in mind when we talk about economies of scale. Because I think when we say that in the water sector, we're normally thinking about connecting physically one pipe to another. We're going to make a small system into a physically larger system, or connect it to a physically larger system. But the organizational economies of scale here are just as important. A larger system is also more financially stable. It's got a larger customer base. If you lose a significant employer, it's not an enormous financial hit. When it comes to things like technological innovation, trying to develop new treatment technologies, new anything technologies, is just very difficult for a small system to take that on. You need not be physically connected. In fact, a lot of the water systems across the United States, especially in the investor-owned sector, the investor-owned many times have very small physical systems that are connected into one larger umbrella organization. So they get those organizational economies of scale, even if the individual systems only serve 300, 400, 500 people, maybe 1,000. They are getting organizational economies of scale, so they can organize like a larger utility. They can get access to those new technologies. And they also get access to better employees. If you're a young, ambitious, smart water professional, you want to work where there's opportunities for advancement, opportunities to work with best technology. That's going to be with a large organization, even if they're physically disconnected. So, more innovation, more resources for the organization. Those are all advantages of economies of scale that have nothing to do with connecting pipes to each other.
Great. So I wanted to go back to the question from Emily. She had a second piece, which was, how are you thinking about the public-private utility debate that's stalling action on this issue? So I think LIHEAP provides an interesting model in that because the energy sector is so privately dominated, the federal program is in part to sort of supplement where we can't expect private companies to fill in for the lowest income people, to subsidize their services and make sure that they have them. The water sector is totally different in that private entities represent maybe 20% tops. Most others are dominated by public systems. Can you speak to sort of this dynamic in the water system and how that affects sort of different approaches to providing water bill assistance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what I would say is that if we start from the definition of the problem, that is, there are thousands of utilities in this country that are chronically out of compliance. They are not providing safe water to their customers, and they have no future plans to be able to come into compliance. They are either in and out of compliance, or they are just out of compliance for a very long time. If I was living in one of those communities, thankfully I live in Washington, D.C., and I have a great large utility, DC Water. They do a great job. But if I was living in a small community that was, in LA County or, in Cook County, just outside of Chicago, I would not, I would be a little upset if my water utility was chronically out of compliance, to say the least, right? I think if we start from there and then we say, okay, how can we get these folks back into compliance? I actually don't care whether or not it's a public company or a private entity that is supplying my water, right? The house I live in, it was built by a private company. Like when we're talking about the things that we need to survive, food, for example, also provided by a private company. And the way that we handle this is that we use the federal government to make sure that the things that that private companies provide are safe for us. So I think that's the role of the federal government, is to make sure that the water that we're drinking is safe. And certainly that has been delegated to the states under the Safe Drinking Water Act for the most part, except for Wyoming, who's very special, and lets the federal government regulate their drinking water. But every other state in the country regulates their water themselves. And, I think that we really need to focus on that being the problem. And the other thing that I would just say is that there are a lot of academic papers out there, including one from the National Academies of Science, that show that private water utilities serve safer water than public water utilities. But the real sort of crux of that article is that it's the utilities of the economies of scale are the ones that are serving up safer water than the private water, than the smaller water utilities. So it's larger utilities, whether they're public or private, are serving safer water. The other thing that I would just say is that there are a lot of things that the private water utilities are doing to provide assistance to people who can't afford their bills. So a lot of water utilities, I work for American Water as one of my clients. They have a program called Help to Others, where they give out millions of dollars a year to help their customers make sure that they can afford their water bills. And if they can't afford it, then they have a thing called Help to Others, which if you think about it, it's H2O, very clever. But it's really very important for us to all be thinking about that, because water, just like food, just like housing, just like electricity, especially in the Northeast and the Southeast, where it gets very cold in the winter, very warm in the summer, those are things that, sort of mean life or death, right? So it's really important that we make sure that they're provided to everybody. But how they're provided, who owns the entity that provides it to you, frankly, I don't care, as long as my drinking water is safe. And I actually think that a lot of Americans agree with me. I think there are a lot of polls out there that show that when it gets down to it, people just want clean, safe, reliable, and affordable water, regardless of who it's provided by.
Thanks, May. So I wanted to turn to another question submitted by Robin about what is the current state of our physical water infrastructure? Does that play a role in setting water rates? So I think maybe Manny or Laurel, if you want to talk about sort of the outstanding needs that you see across the board in capital investments and how that is putting pressure on rates moving forward. Either of you want to take this one?
I'm happy to. Laurel, I'm happy to talk about this.
Go ahead,
yeah,
Manny.
Do you want to? I can add after you.
Sure. So one of the things, there's a broad historical sweep to this. I'm trying to be brief. When Congress passed the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act back in the 1970s, they included a whole bunch of sweeteners for local governments that were going to have to come into compliance with these laws. And that came in the form of billions of dollars. Back then, billion was a lot of money for the federal government. Billions of dollars in assistance to local governments to build treatment works and other kinds of infrastructure. Those programs largely went away by the middle of and to late 1980s. And so during that period of time, water was actually underpriced at the local level because it was effectively heavily subsidized by the federal government. And they created a weird kind of disincentive for local governments to properly maintain and invest in those systems over time, and because of the political pressure to keep rates low. This gets back to that difference between energy and water sector. Because 85% of Americans get their water from a local government, local public officials tend to think about water and sewer rates the same way they think about taxes. Low is good, high is bad. And so infrastructure investment tends to lag. And, the local governments often, not all, but, many times, too many times, local governments will put off necessary investments because they don't want to increase rates. And then they'll wait till systems collapse and fail before they invest. Well, of course, that's not an efficient way to run a system. It ends up being costlier in the long run. And I think that there's an important lesson here when we look at the difference between the public and private sectors. The investor-owned firms, May indicated earlier, there's a very solid body of research, including some by me and my team, that demonstrates that investor-owned firms are much more likely to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the public sector is less likely to. And yet, at the same time, the rates are higher in the private sector than in the public sector. And that has to do with incentives. If you are a private investor-owned firm, the way you make money is by building your rate base, and that means there's an incentive for you to invest heavily in that system. If you're an elected official, your incentive is to keep rates low, and so that means you want to put off investments as long as you possibly can. Now, I'm speaking in broad generalities. There are 50,000 systems. Many of them are run by people who operate them and invest very responsibly, but the political incentives there at the local level are to put off investments until systems collapse. Well, any homeowner or car owner knows that if you run a system to failure, it's going to be costlier in the long run. And I think that's what we're seeing here in too many cases. We're waiting till infrastructure fails before the bills go up, which is one of the reasons why we've seen the bills go up so dramatically in the last 20 years. Those federal subsidies have gone away. Local governments now have to pick up the tab, and they haven't been doing so sufficiently.
Laurel, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, Manny said that much more eloquently than I would have, and completely agree. I completely agree with that. Deferred maintenance is coming home to roost for many systems. The other thing I would, just context I would add to that is, at least in California, and this may be true for other states, there are actually constitutional restrictions for how public water systems can spread costs around their customer base. So in California, we have Proposition 218, which basically restricts water systems from being able to have some customers subsidize other customers. So that really limits the ability of water systems, public water systems, to be able to create low-income ratepayer assistance programs through their basic rate structure, which is why we need, a statewide program and ideally get some additional federal investment in that. And on the private investor-owned side, there are requirements in programs in place around low-income ratepayer assistance in our state. And so, on some level, private investor-owned utilities have more flexibility to be able to provide low-income ratepayer assistance, while at the same time, they have a lot higher rates than public systems. But I think just the only thing I wanted to add to that is, I think May's point that is true in many cases, but I think if we look even deeper, what's really true is that large systems are, whether they're privately owned or publicly owned, are the ones that are able to and doing the kinds of investments, avoiding the kind of deferred maintenance problems that small systems have, and are able to provide still balance that rate affordability with the kind of operational challenges, investment infrastructure challenges, while still trying to address affordability within their rate structure.
Great. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to go around to end to each of you to the threshold question that we're asking, and the title of this event is, should there be a federal water bill assistance program? And beyond that, not just that question, but what is the most helpful thing that Congress can do in this moment to help not only low-income families afford their bills, but also water and wastewater systems that will be facing financial hardships because of the crisis that we're in. So, this threshold question, should there be a water bill assistance program federally, and what would you like it to look like? And number two, what's your top ask of Congress in this moment of need? I'll go first to Laurel.
Yeah, so we absolutely need federal investment in this to address low-income ratepayer assistance. I think the most important thing is being able to get financial assistance from the federal government for states to be able to develop and implement these programs. I think that the so much is important, but I think states can't do it alone without some federal investment. And I think the other big takeaway for me in this topic is just the need to make sure that the investment that is made is within the context of the water sector and the overall water investments and oversight that states are doing to make sure that these sorts of programs are integrating with the operational and system level challenges that are unique in the water sector.
Great. May?
Yeah, I agree completely with Laurel. I do think that obviously, I think it should be apparent by now, I do think that we need a assistance program from the federal government helping people pay their water bills, just like we have for all other necessities that we need. I also think, though, that, as I said in the opening, I think that there's about 100 different reasons why this is a problem, and I think we need about 100 different solutions. So affordability is one of them. Obviously, we've talked a lot about partnership approach and regionalization approach. I think that's also needed. I think there are a lot of things that are needed, and I would love for them all to happen this Congress. I hope they do. I doubt they will, but that's why we'll keep working on it.
Yep. Manny?
Yeah. So on your two questions, number one, a federal assistance program. Sure, but let's be sober and realistic about what it's going to be able to do. It's got to be one small element of a broader comprehensive system. And bear in mind, 40 years of lessons of LIHEAP tell us that 16% of eligible households participate in LIHEAP. That means over 80%. In our very best, the high watermark for LIHEAP, 22% of eligible population participated in LIHEAP. So let's not fool ourselves into thinking we're solving a big problem with a federal water assistance program. At best, we're eating around the edges. My top ask for Congress, not money, regulatory reform. Let's level the regulatory playing field. Let's get stringent. Let's stop letting small systems and bad actors continue to operate unabated. Quality water systems are expensive. We're going to pay with our rates, we're going to pay with our taxes, or we're going to pay with our health and environmental quality. The latter should not be acceptable to any of us.
Thank you, Manny. So I want to thank you all for taking the time today to join us. BPC will continue to work on this issue, and I know you will all help me trying to find some solutions that are sort of common sense and practical and will get people, honestly, the help that they need. So thank you all again. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. You can subscribe to BPC's YouTube channel for notifications on upcoming live events and more BPC video content. Thank you so much and stay safe.